just, okay, just got to notice. Now, language is not really conceived as a mirror of thought, but it actually constitutes thought. The constructions of our language are thought insofar as we can comprehend the notion thought. We have no real notion of thought apart from what can be formulated within our linguistic capacities. That's why Alan Turing, in his famous paper, 1950, on machine thinking, the paper that inaugurated the field of artificial intelligence, he starts the paper by pointing out that the question whether machines can think is too meaningless to deserve discussion. Now, the reason it's too meaningless is we simply have no concept of thought outside of what is formulated within our linguistic capacities. So that's thought as far as we understand it. The identification of language and thought makes good sense. Thought as well as language is a species property. It's common to all humans, the ability to reflect, to conjecture, to evaluate, to assign responsibility, and so on, common to all humans, no analog anywhere in the animal world. So it makes sense to identify these two notions. Well, suppose we get as far as understanding that thought is based on a computational system stored in our, coded in our brain somehow, which enables us to construct, to meet part of the Galilean challenge, to construct an infinite array of thoughts, and then can use them in some fashion which is beyond human comprehension at this point, maybe ever, but to use them in some way that enables others to penetrate the workings of our minds and get a grasp on that problem. Well, what's a computational system? For one thing, it starts with a set of atomic elements, primitive elements. We can take these to be, roughly speaking, words, not exactly words, but the meaning-bearing elements of our language. Let's call them words for simplicity. So there are simple words, and there's a computational procedure which constructs an infinite array of construction of structures which express complicated thoughts of arbitrary complexity and infinite unbounded number using these primitive elements. Well, that raises two questions for inquiry. What is the computational procedure? What are the primitive elements? They both impose serious problems. So let's start with the lexical, the words, the minimal elements. What are they? Well, actually, if you look at them, these are human concepts, the most elementary human concepts. They turn out to be, again, species-specific, common to humans, without any analog in the animal world, in animal communications. This was actually studied to an extent in classical Greece. The first example that was brought up, which I'm sure you know, the pre-Socratics, was the question, how can you cross the same river twice? Turns out to be quite a profound question. If you cross say the Thames in London and cross it again, it's a different object. It's constituted of different material elements. So why is it the same river? Turns out not to be trivial. When you start to think about it, take the Thames, you can make innumerable changes in it, radical changes, and it would still be the same river. You can change the content of what flows through it. Maybe it's pollution from an upstream plant, so it's mostly arsenic, still the Thames River. You can reverse the course, it'll still be the Thames River. You can change the direction so it goes somewhere else, same, still the Thames River. Make radical changes, still the same river. On the other hand, you can make trivial changes, and it's not a river at all. So if you put up walls along the side and start using it for commercial vessels, it's a canal, it's not a river. You made a slight change, but it's not a river. You can make an even slighter change. You can harden this, in theory, you can harden the surface, turn the surface into what's called the glassy state, slight phase change in the physical state. It's what most of the water in the universe is. Draw a line down the middle, start using it for commuting to London. Now it's not a river at all, it's a highway. You made a trivial change, it's not a river. You can make radical changes, still is a river. Every infant somehow knows this. Children are never taught anything like this. When a child learns the word river, knows all of this. It's a human concept, quite complex. What's its nature? Actually, some clarification was given on this matter by Aristotle shortly after. He, in the Metaphysics, asks the question, what is a house? And his answer is that a house is constituted of both matter and form. The matter of the house is the timbers, the bricks, the whatever constitutes its physical structure. The form of the house is what it was designed for, what its characteristic use is, what kind of object is it in our lives, and so on. That's not a physical property. The physicist investigating the house couldn't find any of that. That's the form of the house. So for example, if you have a one-room schoolhouse, its physical constitution is identical, whether you think about it as a house or as a room, but we understand it quite differently. So if we're thinking about it as a house and we want to paint it, we're going to paint the outside. If we think about the same physical object as a room and we want to paint it, we'll paint it on the inside. And in many other ways, it changes. Well, this distinction is critical. In fact, every simple word that you think of, no matter how simple, has all of these properties. It's not identifiable by any physical, extramental characteristics. All of our most elementary concepts are quite intricate and complex, characterized in terms of mental acts, which are not identifiable from physical inspection. That has consequences, many. For one thing, it raises the question how children can ever learn this. They can't. Children acquire vocabulary at a very rapid rate. At the peak periods of language acquisition, around 2 to 3 years old, children are picking up words about once every hour, once every waking hour, meaning essentially on 1 or 2 presentations. And that means that they're getting essentially no information, but they all know all of these words and all of their richness. So it's part of our intrinsic nature that our knowledge and understanding are based on these intricate concepts. It also means, for those of you familiar with philosophy of mind, that the general assumptions about language are just all wrong. The general assumption is that the words of language refer to objects. You see this in the titles of major books, like Quine's book, Word and Object, or Roger Brown's book, Word and Things. Assumption is there are words, there are objects. The words are associated with the objects. That's the relation of reference. Language just doesn't have that relation. There is no relation of reference in language. There is no semantics in the technical sense of Fregean reference-based semantics. Words are just complex mental structures which yield perspectives on how we interpret and understand the world, how we develop our thought. Question arises how this originated. That remains mysterious, but that's one aspect of the problem. The other aspect is what's the computational system? Here too, we face quite interesting properties. Computational, if you take a look back at what I mentioned about evolution, humans appeared roughly 200,000 to 300,000 years ago, separated very quickly, all sharing the language faculty, meaning it was in place before they separated. There's no evidence for any meaningful symbolic activity before the appearance of Homo sapiens. There were lots of hominids around, but no indication of any symbolic activity until Homo sapiens appears. So it seems very likely that this miraculous capacity that amazed Galileo, Frege, and others appeared pretty much along with Homo sapiens. But remember that in evolutionary time, that's a flick of an eye. It's almost instantaneous, which makes it look as though the language faculty must have developed in a very suddenly and in a very simple way. Nature seeks the simplest solution. So presumably what happens is some small rewiring of the brain yielded the capacity for infinite generation. Then nature quickly picked the simplest form of generation, that's our language. It's very likely that that's what happened. And in fact, the more we explore the nature of the combinatorial system, that's the kind of thing that we find. So just to wrap up quickly, what kind of thing do we find? Well, let's take a look at one of the most remarkable and puzzling universal properties of the computational system of language. It's a property that's called structure dependence, meaning for all languages, all constructions, the rules that apply pay no attention at all to the linear order of words and pay attention only to the structural properties. You see this in very simple constructions like just say conjunction. So the men and the boys are here. The man and the boy are here. Why isn't it the man and the boy is here? The copula, the form that it takes, is not determined by the adjacent element, the man and the boy is here, but rather by the structure of the expression. The infants, incidentally, know this as soon as you can test it, well before 2 years old, maybe 18 months old, children already know this, meaning they know it without any experience. They know that they should disregard the linear order and the simple computations of adjacency, and they should pay attention only to abstract structures that their mind constructs. Think about it for a minute. It's quite a puzzling fact. And it becomes more puzzling when you look into it more closely. So take, say, the bombings of the city were crimes. Again, were, not was, even though city is singular. The bombing of the cities is a crime. Again, you look at the more remote element, not the close one. Here it's a matter of not just ignoring all linear order and adjacent relations and simple computations, but carrying out a fairly complex computation which constructs an abstract structure and finds the part of that structure that is determinative of the meaning and interpretation. Well, that's what infants do reflexively without any experience. And if you look into the computation involved, it's not trivial. You can see it in, just to give one last example of a different kind, take the sentence, the men fixed the car carefully, fine sentence. The men carefully packed their tools, fine sentence. Put the two of them together. The men who fixed the car carefully packed their tools. Well, that happens to be ambiguous. Could mean they fixed the car carefully or they carefully packed their tools. But put the word carefully in front of the sentence. Carefully, the men who fixed the car packed their tools. That one's unambiguous. Carefully finds a verb, but it's not the closest one. Pack the tools. It's the more remote one. Fix the car. It's not that one. It's the more remote one. Pack the tools. Carefully, the men who fixed the car packed the tools. Once again, the mind is ignoring the simple computations based on linear order. It's paying attention only to abstract structures constructed by the mind. Well, this turns out to be a universal property of language for all constructions, all languages. Ignore, and it's a very puzzling fact. It means that infants reflexively are saying, let's ignore 100% of what we hear, namely words appearing in linear order. Let's ignore all the simple computations like adjacency, and instead, let's pay attention only to something that our mind constructs and that we never hear. Universal, deep property of language, shows up in many ways. It actually makes certain expressions, certain thoughts inexpressible. So take the sentence, instead of conjunction, take disjunction. John or Mary is here. The men or the boys are here. How about the men or Mary is here? That doesn't work. The men or Mary are here. That doesn't work. In fact, nothing works. You just can't say it. If you used adjacency, it would be trivial. Just pick the closest one. That's the one that would determine the form of the copula. But the mind is so constructed that you can't do it. You have to look at abstract structures constructed by the mind. In this case, Mother Nature happens to develop the system which is dysfunctional. You can't express your thoughts in a simple way. There are much more far-reaching examples of that. And in fact, that's the way evolution works generally. If you think about evolution, generally, it has three phases. The first phase is something disruptive happens, maybe a mutation or a bacterium swallows another microorganism. Something just happens. Then Mother Nature steps up and constructs the simplest possible way of handling the new situation. Then that may be completely dysfunctional. Mother Nature doesn't care whether it works or not, just makes the simplest thing. Then comes a third process, winnowing, picking of all the options around, the ones that are most functional. That's natural selection. But that's only a peripheral part of evolution. And in the case of human language, it probably never happened. It's too quick. Some disruptive element took place, rewiring of the brain. Mother Nature found the simplest solution. There never was any winnowing. It's too fast. We're all the same. It happens to yield dysfunctional properties. Turns out that there are many cases much more serious than this one, where the structure of language is dysfunctional for the purposes of communication, but perfectly structured from the point of just elegance and simplicity. It's the way evolution works. That's the way language seems to work. That seems to be the general terrain that we face. The next task is to show that the apparent variety of languages, the superficial complexity of languages, can all be reduced to these very simple operations, which in fact are the perfect ones for forming an optimal, elegant computational system which will construct an infinite array of thoughts. That seems to me the general task for the study of language and the study of mind, and they're very intimately related. Should make one maybe last point about this before turning it over to you. I mentioned the classic Cartesian body-mind distinction, body based on what Aristotle called matter. The mind is giving something like what Aristotle called form. Crucially, the capacity of language to construct infinitely many thoughts. Well, the Cartesian picture was in fact the standard picture of early modern science. Early modern science was based on what was called the mechanical philosophy. Philosophy, of course, meant science. The assumption of Galileo, his associates, Leibniz, Huygens, Isaac Newton, Descartes, all of them, was that the world is a complicated machine, a far more complicated variant of what skilled artisans were developing at the time and scattering through Europe amazing clocks and artifacts that could do amazing things and so on. The world was just a more complicated case of that. And that's what Descartes assumed. That's body. And as he argued, that can't account for the properties of language and mind. Well, Isaac Newton, showed to his dismay that there aren't any bodies. There are no mechanical objects. All mechanical objects, all the things we think are mechanical objects, actually have properties that are not mechanical. Interaction at a distance, repulsion and attraction. These are, as Newton demonstrated, contrary to what everyone believed, these are not expressible in mechanical terms. Newton himself regarded this as a total absurdity that no person with any scientific consciousness could accept. He was harshly condemned by the other great scientists of the day, like Leibniz, for reintroducing occult properties that the new science was aiming to rid itself of, but there was no way out. Science just had to lower its expectations. Can't develop an intelligible universe. John Locke reacted to this immediately, pointing out, as he put it within his theological framework, just as God has assigned to matter properties of which we cannot conceive, like attraction and repulsion at a distance. Similarly, God might have superadded to matter the property of thought. Property of thought is just some property of some organized aspect of matter. It's known in the history of philosophy as Locke's hypothesis. By now, it's kind of taken for granted. Somehow thinking, language are just some kind of properties of organization of whatever the world is constituted of. That's modern science, modern neuroscience, and so on. So that's approximately where we are. The next step is to answer all the huge array of unanswered questions that arise as soon as you formulate these issues. So why don't I stop there?
Thank you, Dr. Chomsky, for what was a very interesting and profound lecture. I would now like to welcome everyone who has questions to pose them. As I can see, many of you already have them. I'll just start calling them person by person, and I ask you to unmute yourself and pose the question. And if you have a question, please raise your hand virtually through the reaction method on Zoom. So the first one was Ivan.
Yes, thank you very much for your talk. You mentioned just how intertwined in our society thought and language are, and by that I mean that the only way I think I'm capable of is expressing very complex, abstract ideas is through the use of language. And I would like to ask whether you think that it's necessary that a civilization can only have one such tool at a time, or do you think there could have been times where we had separate frameworks, such as language, that are capable of expressing complex ideas, or if you see a chance in the future for us to develop several such frameworks?
Well, let me just qualify that for a moment by pointing out that the same is true of the most simple ideas. So crossing the same river twice, it's not a complex idea, but it turns out it's about as simple as an idea as we have, but it's extremely complex and intricate. As soon as we look into it, there are no simple ideas. There are only intricate, complex ones constructed by our minds, and worth keeping that in mind. Well, what about different languages, different ways of thinking? First of all, are there different languages? Looks like it on the surface, obviously, but just consider the things that I mentioned before, the simple things I mentioned, the meanings of the word river and house, in fact, every word, the fact of structure dependence in the computational system. These are universals. They're the same for everybody. In fact, the more we look at language and thought, the more it turns out they seem to be identical among all humans. There's enormous superficial differences, of course. Like if my wife happens to be Brazilian, if she talks Portuguese, to me it just sounds like noise. But that's just because I'm past the age where a child reflexively converts the noise into an internal language. Can't do that at my age. But if you look into the internal nature of the system, they don't differ very much. In fact, it's entirely possible, we can't prove this yet, but research is tending to the direction which it may reach, which will show that the internal system, the system of constructing thoughts, is essentially uniform among humans, and that the apparent differences among language have to do with the way all of these internal workings are externalized into the sensory motor system. So if you want to think of an analog, take your laptop. Your laptop can have an internal program in it, let's say multiplication, but it can be attached to any printer. Doesn't care what printer it's attached to. The printer will come out looking very different depending on, does it color, is it not colored, one thing or another. But the internal program in the laptop doesn't care what printer it is. It seems that language is pretty much like that. There's an internal system which constructs thought. It doesn't care what printer it's associated with. Could be English, could be Greek, could be Portuguese, Swahili, just one or another printer. In fact, it doesn't even have to be sound, could be gesture. We now know that sign language is almost identical with spoken language in its structure, its mode of acquisition, just about every property. But the internal printer doesn't care. can use any sensory motor system. And it increasingly seems to be the case that the apparent variety of languages, the complexity of language, the easy mutability of language from one generation to another, all of this seems to have to do with the printer, with the externalization of the system to one or another sensory motor system. So it could be that in a rather deep sense, we're very much alike. And there is one fundamental system of constructing thoughts. Now, I'm going beyond what can be shown, but it seems to me that's the direction in which inquiry seems to be tending.
Thank you very much.
Next question is by Gabriel.
Hello. I'm full of emotions. My question is both a linguistic one and a political one. We know that Americans nicknamed their 16th president Honest Abe. And after the bloody Battle of Gettysburg, he said that the government is of the people, by the people, for the people. How honest do you think he was? Because we know that it seems like America wasn't projected to be a democracy. We know that John Adams, the second president of the United States, hated the word democracy. What does democracy means to you? And what should democracy mean to in American history?
It's a very far-reaching question. We can start with the Constitution. The United States is pretty unusual, in fact unique, in that it has a long-standing written constitution, which is treated almost as holy writ. So the justices of the Supreme Court are sworn to interpret the law in terms of the Constitution, in terms of what a group of wealthy white slave owners put together in 1789, meeting in Philadelphia. And we know what they thought. There's extensive records of the discussions of the Constitutional Convention, very good scholarship on the topic, very careful scholarship. So we understand very well what they had in mind. They were worried about the threat of democracy. Their concern was that there might be too much democracy. James Madison, the main framer of the Constitution, was very explicit about it. He said that a prime goal of government is to protect the minority of the opulent against the majority. That's a prime goal of government. Therefore, the government was constructed so as to ensure that there would not be the kind of democracy that most of the population wanted. For example, if you look at the structure of the American political system, it's changed over the centuries, of course, but go back to the 18th century, Madison, Hamilton, the others who designed it, the main center of power in the constitutional system is the Senate. The Senate has 6-year terms, so not subject to public pressure. The Senate was not elected. It wasn't until 1913 that the Senate was elected. It was selected by elites. So the Senate was a non-representative body selected by elites, and it was the main center of power in the government. The executive at that time was more or less an administrator, not like today. The Senate, to go back to Madison, was to be constituted by the wealthy men of the nation. those who have sympathy with property owners and their rights. I'm quoting him. That's the Senate. And their goal must be to preserve the permanent interests of the country, namely the rights of property and property owners. Remember, they were almost all slave owners. So one of the main components of property was just slaves. That was the wealth of the nation. Well, that's the Constitution. In fact, the major scholarly work on the Constitution, the gold standard of scholarship, Michael Klarman's book, Harvard University professor, the title of the book is The Framers' Coup, The Framers' Coup Against Democracy. The Constitution was a coup by rich, white slave owners against democracy. That's the way it was constituted. Well, of course, a lot of the population didn't accept that. There were constant struggles, battles, goes on over the centuries, many changes, but to a certain extent, that framework remains. So if we come up to the present day and take a look at the way the formal democratic system actually functions, there are some very straightforward questions you can ask about it. And they are asked within mainstream academic political science. So one simple question you can ask is, what percentage of voters, about half the population doesn't bother voting, but take the voters. Among the voters, what percentage of them are actually represented by their own representatives? Okay, that's a pretty straightforward question. You can take voters, you can ask, what are their preferences? What do they want? What are their interests? I have a ton of information about this from extensive studies of attitudes. So we know very well what the voters want. Then we can look at the votes of their own representatives. And we can ask how they correlate. Straightforward question. Studied quite carefully by serious political scientists. The answers are quite instructive. Turns out that a large majority of the population are literally not represented by their own representatives, meaning there's essentially no correlation between their preferences and the way their own representatives vote. Well, in fact, if you look at the actual numbers, it's pretty striking. The most recent study, very sophisticated study using deep learning and so on, came up with a figure of 90% unrepresented, meaning essentially the lower 90% in the wealth record. The representatives are listening to other voices, and the other voices that they're listening to, pretty easy to detect. When you look at American elections, you find out pretty much that they are bought, meaning you can predict the outcome of an election for Congress or the president with very high precision, simply by looking at campaign spending, at the concentration of campaign spending, not the total amount, but how it's concentrated among crucial wealthy sectors. That's, well, that's American democracy. Pretty much the way the framers intended it, as protecting the minority of the opulent against the majority. That leads to plenty of conflict, plenty of anger, resentment. I should say in Europe, it's even worse. In Europe, under the European Union is constructed, designed to undermine democracy, crucially. Decisions are within the framework of the European Union. Basic decisions are removed from the national level, where there's some responsiveness of parliament to the population to some extent. It's removed from there to an unelected bureaucracy in Brussels, the Troika, European Commission, unelected, IMF, obviously, unelected, European Central Bank, unelected. That's where the basic decisions are. And of course, they have the German banks looking over their shoulders, telling them what to do. You have a severe deficit of democracy, and it shows both in Europe and the United States. It shows dramatically after the last 40 years of the neoliberal assault on the population, which magnified all of this. A lot of anger, resentment, contempt for democratic institutions, the traditional parties collapsing, rise of fringe groups, angry people, rise of demagogues who say, I'll be your savior. We got to get rid of these bad people like immigrants or the blacks or somebody terrible out there, and I'll save you. You're seeing this all over Europe and the United States. And a lot of this is just the reflections of what you're talking about, the collapse of democratic structures, quite consciously, didn't just happen. The neoliberal programs, the austerity programs, the rest of them were designed to have the effects that they do have. It's a very severe crisis throughout a lot of the world. We're living right in the middle of it. It's very, in the United States, it's pretty shocking. Now, you might take a look at the New York Times this morning. It's a very interesting article appeared investigating the Republican Party. The Republican Party in the United States is becoming kind of like the fringe right-wing parties in Europe, like AfD and Alternative for Deutschland, Le Pen, others. It turns out among the Republican Party, about probably a third, maybe 40%, I think it's important, it's going to be necessary to use violence to restore our traditional way of life, meaning white supremacy, misogyny, racism, colored people know their place, want to use violence to restore it. A very high percentage, probably a quarter of them, believe in the QAnon conspiracy theories. I don't know how much you know about that, but it's beyond lunacy. It's the belief that elites have been taken over by a satanic, pedophilic cult, which is trying to destroy our way of life. It's maybe 25% of Republicans. It's about the same size as the major religions, okay? The major Protestant religions. It's, these are signs of very severe pathology. You see it in, we saw it on January 6th with the attack on the Capitol building by people who are really committed to saying, we have to save our country from these elites, you know, these satanic pedophiles who are trying to destroy us. I mean, when that happens in the most powerful country in the world is in deep trouble. And Europe is not that much different. These are very serious problems.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you a lot.
The next question is by Nelly.
Hello, thank you for your lecture. And I would like to ask, since you mostly define the humankind as the only kind that possesses the ability to express the thoughts by the language, well, I have recently read the book 1984 by Orwell, and when reading about Newspeak, I noticed that I actually face it every day, and that in general, people have started, especially people my age, have started to communicate with less and less vocabulary, with less and less words, and everything is either bad or cool, not cool, very cool. So have you also noticed this, and do you also consider it a problem?
Sorry, I couldn't catch it. Could you either write it out or maybe somehow repeat? For some reason, I couldn't catch what you were saying.
Low battery. Christian Cabra.
Sorry?
Christian Cabra.
Sorry, wait just a second. Mr. Chomsky, can you hear me now?
Oh, now I can.
Okay. So could you ask the last question to be just repeated, please?
I'm sorry. Could you tell me what the last question is?
Yeah, Nelly, if you could just repeat perhaps the end.
Yes, no problem. I will repeat. So Mr. Chomsky defined the humankind as the only one who possesses the ability to express the thought by the means of language. This is something with which we are unique. And I recently read the book 1984 by Orwell, and when I read about newspeak, I noticed that I actually face it every day around me, and that people, especially people my age, have started to communicate with less and less words. Everything positive is cool or super cool, or everything negative is just not cool or bad. No wealth of the vocabulary, no complex words, no variety of words. So do you consider that this is a problem, and have you also noticed it? That was my question.
Yeah. Sorry, I can only hear scattered parts of it. Would you be able to write it out in the chat?
Yeah, so Nelly, could you please write that out in the chat?
All right.
And we'll go to the next question, and then we'll take Nelly's question at the end of it. I'm not sure, I'm sorry, Mr. Chomsky, I'm not sure what your agreement was with Micha, how long they should be, but I propose that we take 2 more questions and then slowly wrap up. Is that fine with you?
Okay, I'm sorry. This computer just doesn't have a very good audio, I'm afraid.
Okay.
But
you can hear me, right?
I can barely hear, yeah.
Okay, I'll try to speak louder. Maybe that'll help. Okay, is it okay if we take 2 more questions?
Yes.
Okay, so let's take, I'm not sure, Philip, who was the next one online?
Yeah, the next one is Alon, but also be prepared to maybe write the questions down in case you need to.
Alon, could you please write your question in the chat? Just so that we
first try to say it, okay, and then I will write.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, so first of all, thank you very much. And my question is about linguistics again. You mentioned how children can use very little data to learn fairly complex language structures. But to me, it seems that children can learn a lot of things using very little data. Like a child can learn to ride a bike in less than an hour. So why not think that language is simply a case of our more general ability to learn using very little data? Why think it's something special?
Sorry, I still can't.
Okay.
I will write it down. One moment.
They will write the questions in the chat.
I can
Okay.
somehow hear your mic.
Let's see. Oh, okay. I've enabled chat so that you can chat to everyone. Okay. Mr. Chomsky, the questions will come in the chat. Okay. So just please read the chat.
Yeah,
and
I see the chat, but I don't see anything here.
Yeah. No, it's not yet. They're still writing them.
Oh,
it'll be in a second.
Okay, that'll be easier. Yeah. I'm sorry, I just can't hear very well.
Oh, that's fine. It's fine. No, let's please everyone, let's stick to what we said. 2 more questions. So 1 question from Alon and 1 question from Nelly, and then we will slowly wrap up so we don't burden Mr. Chomsky too much.
Okay, I'll just waiting for the questions. Okay.
Okay,
Yeah.
can you see the first
I
question?
see the first question. Shall I read it?
Yes, you can perhaps, yeah.
You mentioned the fact that children can learn complex structures from little data, but it seems to me that children can learn almost everything from little data. Child can learn to ride a bike in under an hour. Why do I think that language is special and not simply a case of our general ability to learn from little data? Actually, I think that's correct, except for the word learn. Language is very much like other instinctive abilities. Our instinctive capacities enable us to develop rich, complex capacities from very little data. Has almost nothing to do with learning. Learning is very peripheral to it. We know this from every aspect of organisms' development. So when you talk about learning to ride a bike, it's not learning, it's just making a minor adjustment to what the child knows instinctively, how to balance. We use that when we walk. When we walk, we automatically know how to balance one leg rather than another. So if you're on a bike, it's slightly different. You have to slightly adjust your instinctive capacity to balance. You know how to push the pedals because that's basically the same as walking. You know how to steer because you know how to walk in one direction or another. So essentially riding a bike is taking things you already know because it's your instinctive nature and slightly modifying them for this new situation. And in fact, language is very much like that. So is everything else. Now take your visual system. We happen to know a lot about the development of the visual system because the human visual system is very similar to the visual system of other mammals. And there has been invasive experimentation of the visual system of cats and monkeys. So we know pretty much how it works and develops. Well, it's quite interesting. Turns out that if you take a kitten and you blindfold it during the first few weeks of life, doesn't see any light, then it never can see. Its visual system just doesn't develop. If you give the kitten diffuse light, so as if you put something like a ping pong ball over its eyes so it gets light, but it's diffuse, visual system collapses, can't see. If you give the kitten straight lines, not vertical lines, not horizontal lines, its visual system will be attuned to pick up vertical but not horizontal lines. In fact, during the first few weeks of life, modification of the visual system can lead to very different systems that come out. Well, it's not learning. It's kind of learning, if you like, but it's a way in which the fixed internal systems, genetically determined, adjust themselves to slight differences in the environment. And language seems to be very much like that. It's all built in, genetically determined. Slight differences lead to what appear on the surface to be very different outcomes. So I think the question is correct, but has the point sort of backwards. It's not that children learn everything from very little data. It's that children virtually don't learn at all. They adjust their innate systems to slight differences in the environmental output. And what's called learning is seriously misinterpreted. There are cases of things you call learning, like when you memorize something to pass a test. Okay, that's learning. But that barely ever even sticks in your mind. The things we usually call learning are just growth and development of instinctive characteristics. This is actually true for animal training as well. It's an interesting question. So I think there's something serious to the question, but I think it's put backwards. I think there should be another question coming along, but I don't see it yet.
Yeah, there's another question.
Is there?
Yeah. Just let me resend it to you. I'll send it to everyone so that everyone can see it.
Okay.
Do you see it?
I get it.
Maybe read it again just so that everyone can.
You want me to read it? Define our kind as the only one possessing the ability to express thought by language. I recently read the book 1984. When I read the part about newspeak, I noticed that I hear it every day. People communicate with just a few words. Everything positive is cool, the negative is not cool. This applies to people my age. Have you noticed this, and do you consider it a problem? Well, I noticed something. I mean, you have to bear in mind, I'm 92 years old, so I'm not your age. You're a different species, but I do notice it. What I notice is, for example, a bunch of kids at McDonald's sitting around a table having a hamburger, and two conversations going on. One is the one around the table, rather superficial, just like you described. And another one is each one talking on his smart, whatever it is, to some other person and having some other conversation. That's strange phenomenon for me, but and it does lead to extremely superficial relations among people. I could see it with my own grandchildren. Like, I remember once my granddaughter told me that she's having an exam in class and she had 200 friends who told her, gave her good wishes. She thinks they're friends. I mean, they're not friends. You know, there's somebody you put something on your Facebook and they say like or something like. I mean, if that's friendship, you're really in trouble, you know. But there are now universities in the United States where on the sidewalks they have plaques saying, look up, meaning don't just look at that thing in your hand, but look and see if there's a person over there. All of this is, how serious it is, you know better than I do. I just see it from the outside like an observer from outer space, but it looks to me as if it's creating a very kind of superficial society with very thin interactions, not serious, considered ones, but how far it reaches, I don't know.
All right. Allow me, Mr. Chomsky, to thank you in the name of everyone here. I think really this is an excellent insight into your thoughts, into your viewpoints, and everything that you have to tell us. I'm sad that, you know, we can't ask you questions for 10 hours, but I trust that we need to impose some limits on our curiosity. So again, allow me to thank you again. I trust everyone has gathered a lot of valuable information and insights from your comments. And thank you for attending. I hope we weren't too bothersome. Okay, so now, so this is it for everyone who is not an evaluator. Those of you who are evaluators, the breakout rooms that you were in previously are still open. So you can simply rejoin the same rooms you were in before by clicking on the breakout rooms button at the bottom. That's where you can then go back into the evaluation rooms. If you do not have your essays and all the data, I will be with you shortly to give you all the information you need. Otherwise, thank you everyone for coming, and we'll see you tomorrow as the schedule